My name is George Chamberlain. I'm with the Global Aquaculture Alliance, and it's my pleasure to speak to you today about the impact of COVID-19 on aquaculture. Let's begin with the human toll. It's tragic that we've already had 4 million people around the world infected and 280,000 deaths. 2/3 of the countries in the world are in varying stages of lockdowns, curfews, movement controls, restrictions on foreign travel, and some countries and regions within countries are doing much better and others much worse than the average. It's a very difficult time, but restrictions are beginning to be relaxed and life is beginning to turn somewhat back to normal. Let's think about the impacts on the major seafood markets. In the US, there have been 1.3 million people infected and 79,000 deaths. Just to put that in perspective, that's about 1/3 of the global infections, yet the US only has 5% of the global population. So we're having a much worse time of it than other countries. Unemployment in the US is at a record high of 33 million people, which is 14.7% unemployment. But states are already beginning a trial and error phase of reopening according to varying timelines and guidelines that differ among states according to the risks that each one has. Canada is following a similar pattern with their provinces opening at different rates. So it's a very fluid and very tense situation. In China, the GDP growth in the first quarter dropped from what would normally be 6% to minus 6.8%. But China has recovered very quickly. Restaurants are now open, although at about 60% capacity. Domestic travel is cautiously starting, but foreign visitors are still prohibited. Japan extended its state of emergency until the end of May, and foreign visitors are still prohibited from entry. In the EU and UK, the situation varies depending on the nation. In the UK, it is still in full lockdown. In the EU, Germany and Austria are probably the most advanced in reopening, but travel is restricted throughout the continent. Looking forward, we don't expect life to return to normal anytime soon, because that would require herd immunity where the majority of the population is immune to COVID-19. So social distancing must continue until a vaccine is available, which is expected to take 18 to 24 months. And during this time period, we have to be prepared for secondary outbreaks around the world. For example, just today we heard that Wuhan, China, had some additional infections. This is likely to occur over and over again over the next couple of years. It's important to note that COVID-19 does not infect seafood itself, but it has many, many impacts, indirect impacts on the seafood sector. One of the primary impacts is the market channel. With the closure of the food service sector, which is restaurants, catering, hotels, which previously had been the major source of seafood consumption, especially in the United States, and the closure of wet markets, which have been important, especially in Asia. This led to a great increase in seafood consumption at retail and through e-commerce. One of the positives that we'll talk a little bit more about later in this presentation is the tremendous transformation this is causing in Asia, where live and fresh fish are normally bought in wet markets, and now they're increasingly purchased at retail and through e-commerce. There's also been a major impact on logistics. At the local level, movement controls have prevented workers from getting to their jobs. This has slowed down nearly every business around the world. Internationally, air travel is essentially shut down, and that loss of passenger air travel has resulted in much reduced air freight capacity and greatly increased air freight prices, which have impacted species like lobster, salmon, sea bass and sea bream, and tilapia. So now we're having situations where premium fish are ready for harvest for the fresh export market, but there's no market to receive them, and the fish are simply too expensive or the inappropriate species for domestic sale. Another major impact has been on worker safety, which is mainly a problem in processing plants. We first saw this with meat packing plants, especially in the US, where poultry and meat packing is a highly consolidated business and large numbers of workers are placed shoulder to shoulder along conveyor belts and very vulnerable to COVID-19. And inevitably, there were outbreaks within plants. Those individuals inadvertently transferred the disease to the community, causing major health problems, and those plants were shut down. This created such a food supply problem with poultry and beef that President Trump signed an executive order to reopen those plants. Well, similar issues have occurred at seafood processing plants around the world, but to a lesser degree. And seafood processing plants are reacting for the health of their workers and for the community by implementing enhanced sanitary controls. This includes things like screening with temperature checks of workers, interviewing workers as they arrive to make sure they're not ill and they haven't been traveling, banning visitors, increased personal protective equipment, greater social distancing among workers, which can involve fewer workers but more shifts during the day. And looking at the right of the screen, you see a graphic developed by OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and the CDC, the Centers for Disease Prevention and Control, showing the typical scenario at the upper part of the screen, showing 4 workers, 2 of them side by side and the other 2 across the conveyor belt, that are not far enough apart. And the alternatives are, instead of 4 workers, to just have 2 and separate them by at least 6 feet or 2 meters. Even better would be to have those 2 with a physical barrier between them. And then another alternative is to have all 4 and have 2 physical barriers, 1 down the length of the conveyor belt and 1 separating the workers in the other dimension. I'd like to now switch to the production sector and begin with China, the world's largest aquaculture producer that produced 51 million metric tons of aquaculture products in 2019. Here you see a list of the top 10 freshwater species, and you see that it's dominated by various species of carp and tilapia. The species mix is changing. China is shifting from low-value species like common carp, silver carp, and bighead carp to high-value species like largemouth bass, catfish, and mandarin fish. And the government is also pressing for greater environmental controls, and it is steadily removing cage systems from many of the lakes and reservoirs where they're causing too much eutrophication, too much waste deposition into those water bodies. The U.S. Soybean Export Council has introduced an alternative to produce large volumes of fish, but with low environmental impact, using what is called an in-pond raceway system. And you see pictures of it here. That has increased from 3 demonstration cells as a pilot in 2013 to over 6,000 of those units in 2019. Now, one of the advantages of the IPRS, the in-pond raceway system, is that fish are raised at high density in raceways, which receive a continuous flow of water from the main receiving body, for example, a lake. But at the end of the raceways is a sedimentation channel, where all of the solid waste and uneaten feed accumulates before the water returns into the receiving water body. And there's actually a moving vacuum that sucks up that solid waste and deposits it into that incline sluice that you see on the left-hand side of the screen. So it's a very innovative and creative way of preventing the pollution of lakes and streams by removing the waste before it enters. Going back to the impact of COVID on China's freshwater fish production, in that period where the peak outbreak occurred in China during January to March, there was a strong reduction in sale of fish. And in fact, in some areas, the reduction was 90 or 95% down from normal. But now transport and logistics have returned to normal. Stocking has been somewhat delayed by about 2 weeks, and the logistical issues have caused some increased feed prices. So the cost of fish production is going to be somewhat higher, but freshwater fish prices are also higher. And for example, about 20% higher for grass carp. So the freshwater fish production in China will come through okay. There's a similar situation with freshwater fish throughout Asia. Almost every country has similar challenges and similar outcomes. One of the very big changes in China, as I mentioned early in the presentation, is the shift from traditional wet markets to retail and e-commerce. Here you see photos of traditional wet markets where fish and crustaceans and bivalves are held live in aerated water or fresh on ice. And this allows the Asian consumers to inspect and select the fish that they prefer, the seafood they prefer. But now that those are closed, the market is shifting to retail. And here you see beautiful fish processed. They can either be whole or gilled and gutted, or large fish like grass carp can be sectioned. For example, a consumer may wish to just buy the head of a grass carp for soup, for example. And there's also very efficient delivery services, both from retail to the consumer and e-commerce to the consumer. Here you see motorbikes with insulated containers carrying the seafood to the consumer. Let me draw your attention to one of the latest concepts in China. Alibaba, one of the very big players in e-commerce, has introduced a new retail concept. It's pronounced Huma. And you can find a link to it at the bottom of this photograph. And I would highly recommend watching it because it's as if you're being transported into the future to see how retail might work years from now. But actually, there are already 65 of these Huma retail outlets in China. They basically are connecting the retail experience with their online e-commerce app, which connects the user to the full provenance of every product just by scanning the barcode on any particular product listing as they walk around the store. There's a restaurant where the products are delivered by robot to the consumer. There also workers are fulfilling orders and delivering them to consumers at the same time as others are shopping. And they can deliver to customers within 3 kilometers within 30 minutes of the order. And of course, checkout is automatic. There will be no cashiers. It's a fascinating concept. One of the other main producers of freshwater fish is Egypt, where Egyptians actually prefer tilapia more than chicken. With the live markets being closed, freshwater fish consumption in Egypt has dropped somewhat, but it's essentially stable because it's a very important staple product. However, fisheries landings have dropped dramatically, probably 50%, and prices have also dropped because once again, those high-value marine fish rely on fresh markets and export markets, and especially in the food service sector. And the same, unfortunately, has happened in Greece and Turkey with the sea bass and sea bream business, where because of lack of fresh food service markets, they've lost a major part of their market share and are really suffering. Trout, on the other hand, in Turkey is still doing okay, maybe only a 10 or 15% drop. On the shrimp side, the new concerns in China are two diseases, one called DIV1, which is decapod iridescent virus 1 in the Pearl River Delta. That's actually a recurring disease, but one that we're keeping an eye on. And then a brand new one that causes post-larval shrimp to appear glass-like and with high mortality in the hatchery. And this has tentatively been called HPTV, or hepatopancreatic translucence virus. And we expect a couple of new publications on that disease to come out in the next few weeks. On the positive side, there's a resurgence of black tiger shrimp in China, and it's doing quite well. In Vietnam, the shrimp farming business is in the south of the country where there are very few COVID problems, and it's operating almost as normal, with hatcheries up to about 70% capacity now, and an increasing use of intensive tank farms. In India and Ecuador, the scenario was almost the same. In March with COVID, farmers tended to panic and sell their product as quickly as possible, which caused low prices and was difficult for packing plants to handle because both India and Ecuador were only at about 40% capacity in the processing plants due to lack of workers. And India also has the unique problem of having broodstock limitations because shipments from Hawaii are limited by lack of air freight. Now let's wrap up with near-term, mid-term, and long-term expectations. First of all, the challenge. Consumer budgets are expected to be tight with all the unemployment, so expensive seafood items may suffer. On the other hand, Asian customers are learning that fresh fish from retail and e-commerce is just as good and even more convenient than live fish from the wet market. Western consumers are learning to prepare seafood at home. Eventually, when food service opens again, total consumption should be even higher. And there's a greater awareness of biosecurity throughout the aquaculture world, which is important considering that disease is the #1 issue in aquaculture. In the midterm, we expect some positive benefits from this COVID technology boom. There's improvements in diagnostic technology, rapid diagnostics, vaccines, and much improved communications tools like this one that we're enjoying now. On the processing side, as we mentioned, there are food safety issues, and there's a need for greater investment in processing mechanization to improve worker health and safety. And then long term, we can expect the tailwinds of these mega trends in, for example, global population increase and much greater food demand in the future, 30 to 50% higher protein demand, which cannot be met by scaling today's food systems. There are just too many sustainability issues and climate change issues. New systems are required. Plus, the types of food that we're eating are causing obesity, heart disease, and other diet-related problems. Aquaculture is well positioned to address these challenges with healthy foods produced from environmentally and socially responsible systems. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.